The massive transport ship docked at Arcturus Prime with a gentle thud that barely registered through the hull. Keth pressed his scaled face against the viewing port and stared at the sprawling university complex below. The neutral world stretched out in all directions, its surface dotted with gleaming towers that housed students from dozens of different species across the galaxy. This was where he would spend the next 6 months studying the humans, and he could barely contain his excitement. Keth had been chosen from thousands of candidates across the Drachnary Empire for this honor. The humans had recently joined the Galactic Council, somehow managing to secure membership despite being a relatively young species. The Drachnary Military Command was puzzled by this development. How had such a primitive civilization earned a seat among the galaxy's most powerful races? There had to be some hidden strength, some secret weapon or tactical advantage that the humans possessed. The young Drachnary warrior straightened his military uniform and checked his ceremonial blade one final time. He had trained his entire life for moments like this. His people were known throughout the galaxy as the finest soldiers and strategists. They had conquered 17 star systems through superior military doctrine and unwavering discipline. If anyone could uncover the human secrets, it would be him. The orientation hall buzzed with activity as students from various worlds mingled and introduced themselves. Keth spotted the humans immediately. They were smaller than he had expected, with soft pink skin and no visible natural weapons. Their movements seemed casual, almost careless, lacking the precision and alertness he associated with military personnel. One of them, a female with short brown hair, approached him with a wide smile. "You must be Keth. I'm Emma, your assigned study partner. Welcome to Arcturus Prime." She extended her hand in what Keth recognized as a human greeting gesture. Her grip was surprisingly firm, though nothing compared to a Drachnary warrior's strength. "I am honored to study your people's military tactics," Keth replied formally. "I hope to learn much about human warfare and strategy during my time here." Emma's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, actually, you're not enrolled in military studies. The exchange program focuses on liberal arts. You'll be taking classes in literature, philosophy, history, and cultural studies. We thought it would help. You understand human society better." Keth felt his excitement drain away. Liberal arts. What use were such soft subjects to a warrior? Where were the courses on battle tactics, weapons technology, and strategic planning? How was he supposed to uncover human military secrets by studying poetry and philosophy? "Perhaps there has been some mistake," Keth said carefully. "I was told I would learn about human military doctrine." Emma shook her head. "No mistake. The program is designed to promote cultural understanding. You'll love it, though. Professor Williams teaches an amazing course on the philosophy of conflict resolution. And Dr. Chen has this fascinating class on the anthropology of warfare." Another human joined them, a quiet young male with dark hair and thoughtful eyes. "This is Marcus," Emma said. "He's studying history with a focus on peace negotiations and treaty formation." Marcus nodded politely. "I heard you're from the Drachnary Empire. Your people have quite a reputation as skilled warriors. I'd love to hear your perspective on some of the conflicts we'll be studying." Keth struggled to hide his disappointment. These humans seemed pleasant enough, but they hardly appeared to be the fierce military minds he had expected to encounter. Emma chatted cheerfully about dormitory assignments and class schedules, while Marcus discussed his research on historical peace agreements. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in weapons or battle strategies the first week of classes. Only deepened Keth's confusion. In literature class, they read ancient human poems about war, but instead of celebrating glorious victories, the works seemed to mourn the loss of life and question the wisdom of conflict. Professor Williams assigned a poem called Dulce et Decorum Est that described war as a terrible lie. Keth read it 3 times, trying to understand why humans would write such things about what should be their greatest achievements. History class was even more puzzling. Dr. Chen taught about humanity's development through various conflicts, but the focus wasn't on military tactics or conquest strategies. Instead, They discussed the social and economic factors that led to wars, the suffering caused by violence, and the efforts made by human leaders to prevent future conflicts through diplomacy and international law. But surely, Keth interrupted during one lecture, your greatest leaders were your most successful military commanders. Dr. Chain smiled thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, Keth. Human society tends to celebrate leaders who ended conflicts rather than those who started them. We often view our military victories as necessary evils rather than achievements to be proud of. The concept made no sense to Keth. In Draknari culture, military prowess was the highest virtue. Their greatest heroes were the generals who had conquered the most worlds and defeated the most enemies. Why would humans feel shame about their victories? Philosophy class proved to be the most confusing of all. Professor Williams introduced concepts like just war theory and proportional response that seemed to suggest humans voluntarily limited their effectiveness in combat. They discussed something called the Geneva Convention, which apparently established rules for how wars should be fought. You mean, Keth asked incredulously, that humans agree to restrict their own military capabilities even during war? But that's correct, Professor Williams replied. We believe that even in conflict, there are moral boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. The protection of civilians, the humane treatment of prisoners, and the proportional use of force are fundamental principles of human military doctrine. Keth's mind reeled. What kind of species would handicap itself in battle? The Draknari philosophy was simple: victory by any means necessary. The idea of showing mercy to enemies or protecting enemy civilians seemed like madness. Emma noticed his troubled expression after class. Are you okay, Keth? You look confused. I am trying to understand, he said slowly, why humans would choose to fight with such restrictions. Does this not make you vulnerable to enemies who do not share these beliefs? Emma considered the question seriously. Maybe in some ways, but we think it makes us stronger in the long run. When people see that we fight fairly and show mercy even to our enemies, they're more likely to trust us and work with us peacefully. As Keth walked back to his dormitory that evening, he felt more confused than ever. The humans he had met seemed kind and intelligent, but their approach to warfare defied everything he understood about military strategy. Perhaps their real strength lay hidden beneath this facade of gentleness. Perhaps the true human warriors were kept separate from civilian students like Emma and Marcus. He would have to dig deeper to uncover the truth about humanity's military power. There had to be more to these strange, soft creatures than they were revealing. The Draknari Empire was counting on him to discover their secrets, and he would not disappoint them. 3 weeks into the program, Keth found himself sitting in the university library long after classes had ended, staring at a collection of human war poetry that made his head hurt. The assignment was simple enough: analyze how different cultures viewed conflict through their literature. But the human texts he read seemed to contradict everything he knew about warrior societies. Emma found him there, surrounded by books and looking increasingly frustrated. Having trouble with the poetry assignment? She asked, settling into the chair across from him. These writings make no sense, Keth said, holding up a book of poems from something called World War I. This human Owen writes about gas attacks as if they were horrific events rather than clever tactical innovations. And this other poet, McCrae, mourns the dead instead of celebrating their sacrifice for victory. Emma leaned forward, her expression growing serious. Those wars were pretty terrible, Keth. Millions of people died, including a lot of civilians. The poets you're reading lived through those conflicts. They saw what modern warfare could do to entire societies. But victory requires sacrifice, Keth insisted. Your poets should honor those who died achieving military objectives, not question the wisdom of their leaders. Maybe that's the difference between our cultures, Emma said gently. Humans started questioning whether victory was worth the cost, especially when we developed weapons that could kill so many people so quickly. Keth pulled out another book, this one filled with photographs from human conflicts. The images showed destroyed cities, long lines of refugees, and mass graves. Your people document their defeats as well as their victories, he observed. Those aren't defeats, Emma corrected. Some of those pictures are from wars we won. But winning didn't make the destruction any less real or the deaths any less tragic. The concept troubled Keth deeply. Drakmari archives celebrated conquests, with grand murals showing enemy worlds burning and defeated populations bowing before Drakmari commanders. Human historical records seemed designed to make war look unpleasant and wasteful rather than glorious and necessary. History class the next day brought even more confusing revelations. Dr. Chun was discussing something called the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended a major human conflict called World War I. Instead of focusing on how the victorious humans had crushed their enemies, the lecture examined how the harsh peace terms had created conditions for an even larger war 20 years later. The human approach to victory seems inefficient, Keth commented during the discussion period. If you had completely destroyed your enemy's capacity to fight, there would have been no second war. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That's certainly one perspective, Keth, but humans learned that total destruction often creates more problems than it solves. The complete devastation of Germany after World War I contributed to economic collapse and political extremism that made World War II almost inevitable. Marcus raised his hand. That's why the Marshall Plan was so important after World War II. Instead of punishing the defeated nations, the Allied powers helped rebuild them. Former enemies became allies. Keth stared at Marcus in disbelief. You helped rebuild nations you had defeated in war. Of course, Marcus said, seeming surprised by Keth's reaction. Germany and Japan are now among our closest allies. Italy, too. It turned out that helping former enemies recover was much more effective than keeping them weak and resentful. The idea seemed insane to Keth. Drakmari doctrine demanded that conquered peoples remain subjugated to prevent future rebellions. The notion of voluntarily strengthening former enemies violated every principle of military strategy he had ever learned. That evening, Emma invited Keth to watch a documentary about human peacekeeping forces. He expected to see elite warriors maintaining order through superior firepower. Instead, he watched soldiers whose primary mission seemed to be preventing conflicts rather than winning them. They stood between opposing forces, distributed food and medical supplies, and spent most of their time talking to local leaders rather than fighting. These are your finest warriors, Keth asked, watching blue-helmeted soldiers helping refugees. Some of them, yes, Emma replied. Peacekeeping requires different skills than traditional combat, but it's considered one of the most important military roles in human society. But they are not conquering territory or defeating enemies, Keth protested. What is the strategic value of such operations? Emma paused the documentary. The strategic value is preventing wars that would cost millions of lives and destroy entire regions. It's much cheaper and more effective to stop conflicts before they start than to fight wars and rebuild afterward. Keth watched more footage of human peacekeepers. They seemed to spend enormous amounts of time and resources protecting civilians who weren't even their own people. Some were shown risking their lives to evacuate enemy populations from combat zones. The behavior made no tactical sense whatsoever. Your soldiers protect people they are fighting against, he said slowly. When possible, yes, Emma confirmed. The laws of war require combatants to minimize harm to civilians, even enemy civilians. It's considered a war crime to deliberately target non-combatants. The term war crime was new to Keth. Emma explained that humans had developed an entire legal framework governing how conflicts could be conducted. There were rules about treatment of prisoners, protection of medical personnel, and restrictions on certain types of weapons. Nations that violated these rules could be prosecuted by international courts. But surely, Keth said, these restrictions only apply when fighting other humans who follow the same rules. Emma shook her head. The laws of war apply regardless of what the enemy does. Even if they don't follow the rules, we're still required to follow them ourselves. Keth felt his worldview cracking. The humans were voluntarily limiting their military effectiveness based on abstract moral principles. They followed rules even when their enemies didn't. They protected civilians who belonged to hostile nations. They helped rebuild countries they had defeated in war. They prosecuted their own soldiers for being too aggressive in combat. From a Draknari perspective, human military doctrines seemed designed to ensure defeat. Yet somehow these strange people had not only survived, but prospered. They had achieved spaceflight, joined the Galactic Council, and earned the respect of older civilizations across the galaxy. Later that night, Keth sent his first report back to Draknari Command. He struggled to find words that would convey what he had learned without sounding completely mad. How could he explain that humans seemed to achieve victory by showing mercy to their enemies? How could he describe a military philosophy based on restraint rather than aggression? The humans appear to possess unconventional strategic thinking, he wrote carefully. Their approach to warfare emphasizes long-term political objectives over immediate tactical advantages. Further study is required to understand the effectiveness of their methods. He deleted and rewrote the message 3 times before sending it. The truth was that he didn't understand human methods at all. Everything about their military culture contradicted basic principles of warfare. Yet they had somehow become powerful enough to demand membership in the Galactic Council. There had to be something he was missing. Some hidden aspect of human nature that explained their success despite their apparent weakness. Emma and Marcus seemed genuinely peaceful, but perhaps the real human warriors were kept separate from civilian populations. Perhaps their true military strength was classified information that students weren't allowed to access. Keth decided to dig deeper. He would request access to military history archives and tactical databases. He would find whatever it was that made humans dangerous enough to earn galactic respect despite their bizarre emphasis on mercy and restraint. The answer had to be there somewhere. It had to be. The philosophy seminar room felt smaller than usual as Keth listened to Professor Williams explain something called just war theory. The concept seemed to suggest that humans had spent centuries developing rules about when violence was acceptable, and how it should be limited even during necessary conflicts. Keth's translator worked overtime to process ideas that had no equivalent in Draknari culture. So you see, Professor Williams continued, Augustine argued that war could only be justified under specific circumstances, to defend against aggression, to recover stolen property, or to punish wrongdoing. But even justified wars must be conducted, with proper intentions and proportional means. A student from the Centauri Federation raised her hand. But doesn't proportional response put you at a disadvantage against enemies who use unlimited force? That's an excellent question, the professor replied. Human military theorists have wrestled with that problem for generations. The consensus is that maintaining moral limits during conflict actually strengthens a society's long-term strategic position, even if it creates short-term tactical disadvantages. Keth felt his confusion deepening. Professor Williams, could you explain how limiting your own military capabilities could possibly be strategically advantageous? Professor Williams smiled, clearly pleased with the question. Consider this example, Keth. During World War II, the Allied forces had the capability to use chemical weapons against Axis populations. Such attacks might have shortened the war and saved Allied lives. However, the decision to refrain from chemical warfare helped maintain Allied moral authority and prevented escalation to even more devastating weapons. Marcus leaned forward in his seat. Plus, by showing restraint, the Allies made it easier for enemy populations to surrender and cooperate during occupation. If you fight too brutally, people resist even after they've been defeated. That's right, Professor Williams agreed. Excessive violence often creates long-term enemies rather than solving immediate problems. Human strategic thinking emphasizes sustainable victory rather than temporary dominance. The discussion moved to something called the Nuremberg trials, where humans had prosecuted their own allies for war crimes committed during what they considered a just conflict. Keth learned that human officers could be court-martialed for following orders that violated international law, even if those orders came from the highest levels of command. You punish your own warriors for being too aggressive, Keth said, struggling to keep disbelief out of his voice. We hold our military personnel to high standards, Professor Williams confirmed. A soldier who commits atrocities damages our strategic objectives and undermines the values we're fighting to defend. Emma spoke up from across the room. My grandfather was a military police officer during the occupation of Germany. He always said that how you treat defeated enemies determines whether you win the peace as well as the war. After class, Marcus approached Keth with obvious excitement. You should come with me to the military history archives. I'm researching peace negotiations, and there's some fascinating material about how human commanders have used restraint as a tactical weapon. The archives contain more information than Keth could process in a lifetime. Marcus showed him records of battles where human forces had deliberately avoided targets that would cause civilian casualties, even when such attacks would have provided significant military advantages. There were accounts of commanders who had risked their own positions to ensure proper treatment of enemy prisoners. Look at this, Marcus said, pulling up a file about the siege of a city during one of Earth's world wars. The human commander could have forced surrender by cutting off food and water to the civilian population. Instead, he allowed humanitarian supplies through enemy lines and focused his attacks only on military installations. Did this strategy succeed? Keth asked. The siege lasted 3 months longer than it might have otherwise, Marcus admitted. But when the city finally surrendered, the population welcomed the human forces as liberators rather than conquerors. The region remained stable for decades afterward, while areas taken by more aggressive tactics required constant military occupation. Keth studied the records with growing amazement. Time after time, human commanders had chosen more difficult, tactical approaches in order to minimize harm to enemy civilians. They seemed to view excessive destruction as a strategic failure rather than a sign of strength. Here's something even more interesting, Marcus said, accessing another file. This documents human peacekeeping operations in the Balkan region during the late 20th century. Human forces were deployed specifically to prevent ethnic cleansing and protect civilian populations. The files showed human soldiers literally standing between opposing armies, using their presence to deter attacks on non-combatants. Some had been killed while protecting people they had never met from nations they had no connection to. The strategic objective wasn't conquest or resource acquisition, but simply preventing mass atrocities. Your people send warriors to die for strangers, Keth observed. Sometimes, Marcus agreed. But those operations helped establish human credibility as honest brokers in international disputes. When humans offer to mediate conflicts now, other species take the offer seriously because we have a track record of putting principle ahead of self-interest. That evening, Emma invited Keth to attend a lecture by a retired human admiral who had commanded peacekeeping fleets in several galactic trouble spots. Admiral Foster was a small, elderly woman who seemed completely unremarkable until she began speaking about military strategy. The greatest victory, she told the audience, is winning without fighting. The second greatest victory is winning a war so decisively that your former enemies become your allies. The worst kind of victory is one that requires you to keep defeating the same enemies over and over again. During the question period, a student asked about rules of engagement in space combat. Admiral Foster's answer shocked Keth to his core. Human fleet doctrine requires commanders to broadcast surrender terms before engaging enemy vessels, she explained. We must provide opportunities for peaceful resolution even after hostilities have begun. Many battles have ended with negotiated surrenders that preserved lives on both sides. But Admiral, another student protested, doesn't that give enemies time to prepare defensive measures or call for reinforcements? Yes, it does, Admiral Foster agreed calmly. And human fleet commanders accept that tactical disadvantage because our strategic objective isn't just to win battles, but to build a galaxy where such battles become unnecessary. After the lecture, Keth approached Admiral Foster directly. Admiral, I'm trying to understand human military philosophy. Your approach seems to prioritize enemy welfare over your own tactical advantages. Admiral Foster studied him carefully. You're the Drachnary exchange student. I've heard about your people's military prowess. Tell me, young warrior, what do you think is the ultimate goal of military force? Victory over one's enemies, Keth replied immediately. And what comes after victory? Admiral Foster asked. Keth hesitated. Draknari doctrine focused intensively on achieving victory but said little about post-conflict objectives beyond maintaining dominance over conquered populations. I see, Admiral Foster said, reading his expression. Human military doctrine is designed around the principle that the purpose of war is to create conditions for lasting peace. Everything else is just tactics. Walking back to his dormitory. That night, Keth felt as if his entire understanding of warfare had been turned upside down. Humans didn't just fight differently than Draknari, they seemed to have completely different objectives. Where Draknari sought to dominate and subjugate, humans appeared to be trying to create some kind of stable galactic order where military force became unnecessary. The strangest part was that their approach seemed to be working. Despite their apparent reluctance to use overwhelming force, humans had earned positions of respect and authority throughout the galaxy. Other species sought human mediation in their disputes and valued human alliance partnerships. Keth began to wonder if he had fundamentally misunderstood what made a species powerful in galactic politics. Perhaps raw military strength was less important than the ability to build trust and cooperation among diverse civilizations, but if that was true, what did it mean for the Draknari Empire? Everything his people had built was based on military dominance and the threat of overwhelming force. Could there really be a more effective approach to galactic power? Keth had convinced Emma and Marcus to join him in the university's Advanced Military Simulation Center, hoping to finally see human tactical thinking in action. The facility used the same combat modeling systems employed by major galactic military academies, capable of recreating complex strategic scenarios with perfect accuracy. If humans possess some hidden military genius, surely it would reveal itself under realistic combat conditions. I've never done one of these before, Emma admitted as they entered the simulation chamber. Are you sure I'm qualified for military? Strategy games. These simulations are designed for educational purposes, Keth assured her. I simply wish to observe how humans approach tactical problems under pressure. Marcus seemed more confident. I've read about most of these historical scenarios in my peace studies research. Should be interesting to see them from a military perspective. The simulation instructor, a gruff Centauri veteran named Captain Rex, loaded the first scenario. Standard planetary defense exercise, he announced. Enemy fleet approaching with 3 times your firepower. Civilian population of 50 million. Your objective is to prevent enemy occupation of the planet. Keth expected the humans to immediately begin planning aggressive counterattacks or desperate last stands. Instead, Emma started asking questions that seemed completely irrelevant to the tactical situation. What are the enemy's stated objectives? She asked. Are they trying to conquer the planet or just eliminate our military forces? Do we know anything about their rules of engagement? It's a simulation, Emma, Marcus pointed out gently. But those are good questions for real-world scenarios, Captain Rex seemed amused. Enemy objectives are planetary conquest and resource extraction. Intelligence suggests they follow standard military protocols but have no specific rules protecting civilians. Emma frowned at the display showing the approaching enemy fleet. What if we evacuated the major population centers and offered to surrender the planet in exchange for safe passage for civilians to neutral territory? Keth stared at her in shock. You would simply surrender without fighting. If it saves 50 million lives, yes, Emma replied matter-of-factly. Planets can be recaptured later, but dead civilians stay dead. Captain Rex raised an eyebrow. Interesting approach, but the simulation parameters don't allow for full planetary evacuation. You have to work with available options. The humans spent the next hour developing a strategy that prioritized civilian protection above all other considerations. They positioned defensive forces to create corridors for refugee movement, established field hospitals in supposedly secure zones, and repeatedly chose to sacrifice military advantages rather than risk harm to non-combatants. When the simulation ended, their defensive forces had been completely destroyed and the planet conquered. However, civilian casualties were the lowest Captain Rex had ever seen in that particular scenario. Tactically, you failed completely, the instructor noted. But your civilian protection protocols were exemplary. In real-world terms, you might have lost the battle but maintained moral authority for future operations. The second simulation was even more revealing. The scenario involved a space battle where human forces possessed overwhelming firepower advantages against a smaller enemy fleet. Keth anticipated watching humans demonstrate the devastating effectiveness that had earned them galactic respect. Instead, Marcus began the engagement by broadcasting surrender terms to the enemy fleet. "Attention enemy vessels," he transmitted. "You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now and your crews will be treated according to galactic humanitarian protocols." "They're not responding to surrender demands," Captain Rex reported. "Enemy fleet is moving to attack formation." "Then we disable their ships without destroying them," Emma decided. "Target weapon systems and engines only. Try to force them to surrender rather than fight to the death." Keth watched in amazement as the humans systematically dismantled enemy capabilities while deliberately avoiding shots that would destroy ships or kill crews. The battle took 3 times longer than necessary, and several human vessels sustained damage they could have avoided by using more aggressive tactics. "Why did you not simply destroy the enemy fleet immediately?" Keth demanded after the simulation ended. "You had overwhelming force advantages." "Because destroying them wouldn't have accomplished anything except killing people," Marcus explained. "Our objective was to stop their attack, not commit mass murder." Captain Rex nodded approvingly. "Your approach actually mirrors real human fleet doctrine. Minimizing casualties while achieving strategic objectives is considered the mark of superior command skills in human military culture." The third simulation presented the scenario that would haunt Keth for the rest of his life. The humans were given command of a fleet capable of destroying entire planets, facing an enemy that had committed massive atrocities against human civilian populations. It was exactly the kind of situation where any rational species would use overwhelming force to eliminate the threat permanently. Emma stared at the tactical display for a long time before speaking. "They killed millions of our people," she said quietly. "Every instinct says they deserve to be wiped out completely." "But," Marcus added, "genocide is still genocide even when it's revenge for genocide." Keth couldn't believe what he was hearing. "They have murdered your civilians on a massive scale. You have the power to ensure they can never do so again. How is complete destruction not the logical response?" Emma turned to look at him directly. "Because then we become the kind of people who destroy entire species. And once you cross that line, where do you stop?" The humans spent hours developing a strategy that would cripple enemy military capabilities while preserving the bulk of their population. They targeted industrial centers rather than cities, focused on government and military leadership rather than general populations, and established strict rules of engagement that protected enemy civilians even while prosecuting total war against enemy forces. "Your approach will require decades of occupation and peacekeeping," Captain Rex pointed out. "Complete destruction would be much more efficient." "Efficient at what?" Marcus asked. "Winning this war or preventing the next 10 wars. When the simulation ended, the enemy civilization had been defeated but not destroyed. Casualties were in the millions rather than the billions, and post-conflict analysis suggested high probability of eventual peaceful integration into the galactic community." "I don't understand," Keth said as they left the simulation center. "You had the power to eliminate a threat permanently, but chose a more difficult path that leaves future risks." Emma stopped walking and faced him seriously. "Keth, can I ask you something? If your people had the power to destroy any species that might someday threaten you, would you use it?" "Of course," Keth replied immediately. "Preemptive elimination of threats is basic strategic doctrine." "Then how would any species ever feel safe around you?" Emma asked. "If everyone knows you'll destroy them at the first sign of potential conflict, they'll unite against you out of self-defense." Marcus nodded. That's why human restraint isn't weakness, it's strategic necessity. Other species trust us precisely because they know we won't annihilate them over minor disputes. That night, Keth lay awake trying to process what he had witnessed. The humans hadn't failed the simulations due to incompetence or technological limitations. They had deliberately chosen more difficult approaches based on principles that seemed to transcend immediate tactical considerations. More disturbing was the realization that their approach seemed to work. Captain Rex had mentioned that human peacekeeping forces were requested throughout the galaxy specifically because other species trusted human restraint and proportionality. The very qualities that made humans seem weak in individual battles apparently made them invaluable as galactic partners. For the first time, Keth began to wonder whether the Drakmari Empire's emphasis on overwhelming force might actually be a strategic weakness rather than a strength. If other species feared and distrusted Drakmari intentions, it would limit their ability to build the alliances and partnerships that seemed central to galactic power. But surely, he told himself, there had to be limits to human mercy. Surely, there were circumstances where they abandoned their principles and fought with the same ruthless efficiency as any other species. The simulations had shown restrained humans, but what about when humanity itself was truly threatened? He would have to dig deeper to find the real limits of human military doctrine. There had to be a breaking point where their famous mercy gave way to practical necessity. The revelation came during what should have been a casual conversation about Earth's industrial development. Professor Williams was discussing humanity's transition from planetary to interstellar civilization when he mentioned something that made Keth's blood freeze in his veins. Of course, the interesting thing about human space exploration, the professor said conversationally, is that we achieved interstellar flight while still maintaining enough nuclear weapons to sterilize several Earth-sized planets. The transition to galactic civilization required some serious discussions about arms control. Keth's translator must have malfunctioned. Could you repeat that, Professor? Nuclear weapons, Professor Williams clarified. Fusion and fission bombs. Humanity developed them during our global conflicts in the 20th century. By the time we achieved faster-than-light travel, our nuclear arsenal could have eliminated most life on Earth dozens of times over. The classroom fell silent as Keth processed this information. You possessed planet-killing weapons while you was still confined to a single world. Technically, yes, the professor confirmed. The major powers maintained nuclear arsenals capable of destroying human civilization. It was called mutually assured destruction. The theory was that no one would start a nuclear war because everyone would die. Emma raised her hand. But didn't we get rid of most of those weapons through disarmament treaties? Eventually, Professor Williams agreed. But the process took decades, and even now there are enough nuclear weapons in storage to devastate multiple star systems if they ever fell into the wrong hands. Keth felt his worldview collapsing around him. Humans had possessed weapons of mass destruction while they were barely capable of interplanetary travel. They had achieved the ability to destroy their own species before they even knew other species existed. And somehow, they had chosen to limit and control these weapons rather than using them to dominate their neighbors. After class, Keth cornered Marcus in the hallway. These nuclear weapons Professor Williams mentioned, how powerful were they exactly? Marcus looked uncomfortable. Pretty powerful, Keth. The largest ones could destroy entire cities with a single blast. The radioactive contamination could make huge areas uninhabitable for generations, and your people built thousands of them. At the peak of the arms race, Earth's nuclear powers had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, Marcus confirmed. Enough to end human civilization and most other life on the planet. Keth's mind raced through the implications. But humans joined the Galactic Council as a peaceful species. You were accepted because you appeared to pose no threat to other civilizations. That's not exactly true, Marcus said carefully. We were accepted because we demonstrated the ability to control and limit our own destructive capabilities. The Galactic Council was actually quite concerned about human weapons technology when we first made contact. That evening, Keth accessed the university's restricted archives using his research credentials. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Buried in classified reports and diplomatic communications were the real records of humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, the Centauri. Federation had discovered Earth during what humans called the Cold War, initial surveys had revealed. A species that possessed fusion weapons, chemical and biological warfare capabilities, and an apparent willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory over their enemies. The Federation's first assessment classified humanity as a potential galactic threat that should be quarantined indefinitely, but then something unprecedented happened. As galactic observers watched, the humans began voluntarily limiting their own weapon systems. They signed treaties banning biological weapons. They established protocols to prevent accidental nuclear war. They dismantled thousands of warheads and destroyed chemical weapon stockpiles. Most shocking of all, they did this without any external pressure. No galactic power had demanded human disarmament. They had simply decided that their own weapons were too dangerous to maintain. Admiral Foster's personal memoir, classified until recently, contained the most disturbing passage Keth had ever read. The Galactic Council didn't invite humanity to join because we were weak. They invited us because we were the first species they'd encountered that was powerful enough to destroy galactic civilization, but chose restraint instead. Our membership wasn't a reward for good behavior. It was a desperate attempt to keep the most dangerous species in known space from becoming hostile. Keth's hands shook as he read further. Human military capabilities, even after decades of arms reduction, remained terrifyingly advanced. Their conventional weapons could glass planets. Their cybernetic warfare systems could cripple entire civilizations without firing a shot. Their industrial capacity could build fleets that would dwarf any existing galactic navy, but the most frightening revelation was how casually humans discussed their own destructive potential. Emma had mentioned her grandfather's service during World War II as if global conflicts involving hundreds of millions of combatants were routine historical events. Marcus talked about nuclear deterrence theory as if the ability to end civilization was just another political science topic. Keth realized with growing horror that every human he had met was a member of a species that had fought wars involving entire planets and weapons that could crack worlds. Their restraint wasn't born from weakness or inability to wage effective war. They practiced mercy because they knew exactly what unrestrained warfare looked like. The final piece of the puzzle came from a conversation with Emma the next day. She was showing him pictures from her family history, including her great-grandfather who had served in something called the Pacific Theater. He never talked much about the war, Emma said, pointing to a faded photograph of a young man in military uniform. But my grandmother said he always felt guilty about the atomic bombs. He thought there should have been another way. Atomic bombs? Keth asked weakly. Oh, that's what we called the early nuclear weapons, Emma explained. We dropped 2 of them on Japanese cities to end World War II, killed over 200,000 people in a matter of seconds. Keth stared at her in shock. Your people actually used these weapons against enemy populations. Once, Emma said quietly, and we've regretted it ever since. That's why we're so careful about weapons of mass destruction now. We know what they can do because we've done it. The terrifying truth crystallized in Keth's mind. Humans hadn't developed their philosophy of restraint through theoretical study or moral evolution. They had learned it through bitter experience with their own capacity for destruction. Every human principle about proportional response and civilian protection was written in the blood of their own species. They practiced mercy not because they were weak, but because they had seen what happened when mercy was abandoned. They limited their weapons not because they feared other species, but because they feared themselves. They had become the most dangerous species in the galaxy and then chosen to become something else. Keth's final report to Draknari Command was the most difficult document he had ever written. How could he explain that the human's peaceful nature was actually a conscious choice made by beings capable of destroying entire star systems? How could he convey that their restraint was not weakness, but the most terrifying form of strength imaginable? Recommendation, he wrote with trembling hands. Under no circumstances should the Drachnari Empire consider military action against humanity or their allies. The humans practice restraint by choice, not necessity. They possess the capability to eliminate entire civilizations but have chosen to build galactic community instead. He paused, trying to find words for the most important warning he could give his people. The humans are not prey. They are predators who have learned to hunt only when necessary. Forcing them to abandon their chosen restraint would result in consequences beyond our ability to survive. In his final personal log entry, Keth wrote, I came here to learn the secret of human military success. I discovered that their greatest weapon is their decision not to use their greatest weapons. They have achieved something no other species has managed. They have become powerful enough to destroy the galaxy and wise enough to choose not to. 3 days later, Keth submitted a formal request for asylum on Earth he could not return to. A civilization that might someday force humanity to remember what they had chosen to forget. The Drachnari Empire would have to find another path to galactic power, one that didn't risk awakening the sleeping giant that called itself humanity. Emma found him in the library on his last day at the university, still struggling to understand what he had learned. Are you okay, Keth? You seem troubled lately. I am beginning to understand, he said slowly, why other species respect humanity so much. You have earned trust not through weakness, but through the most frightening form of strength possible. The strength to choose mercy when you could choose destruction. Emma smiled sadly. My grandfather used to say that the measure of a civilization isn't what it's capable of doing, but what it chooses not to do. I guess that's what makes us human. Keth looked at her with new eyes, seeing not the friendly student he had befriended, but a member of a species that had stared into the abyss of total war and stepped back from the edge. The most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their capacity for violence, but their capacity for restraint in the face of unlimited power. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered the question that would follow him for the rest of his life. What would happen if something ever forced them to stop choosing mercy?